Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Michael Ostro, who is an Alexander Technique teacher who teaches in the Union Square area of New York City and also in North Bergen, New Jersey. He's been teaching for over 20 years and works with a wide variety of clients, including performing artists, athletes, people with chronic pain. He also has a long-time interest in philosophy and mind-body disciplines. He studied Zen Buddhism for a while. And one of the things I believe about the Alexander technique, which we're going to talk about in a moment, is that for him, it's a form of applied philosophy or even Western Zen, as it were. So, Michael, welcome to the show.
Hi, Robert. Thank you.
Michael, could you begin by just giving our listeners a short description of the Alexander technique?
Yes. So I just want to preface it by saying that we're going to be talking about both Zen and the Alexander technique, both of which are very difficult to pin down, very elusive. So I'll just give a quick definition, but it's just provisional. So I would say that the Alexander technique is a way to help free oneself from habitual ways of reacting and behaving and thinking that we don't always notice. And these happen at every level of our being, from physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. So it's a very open-ended way of freeing ourselves from the grip of all kinds of unthought about assumptions.
Mm-hmm. And just listening to that, I can imagine that there are some parallels to Zen Buddhism.
Right. Zen, and again, one could say many things, but in part, it's a way to help people to experience reality directly, reality as it's happening at the moment, which is always unknowable and kind of ungraspable. So Zen's approach is to try to find ways to become more attentive and alert to what's happening rather than all the ideas and concepts we all develop about what's happening.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds pretty similar to the Alexander technique.
Right, and that's why they seem to fit so well together.
Yeah.
Because Zen is very difficult for Westerners often to really get a handle on, and that's what I found in my own experience. And that's gradually what led me to study the Alexander technique.
Mm-hmm.
But
well, well, it's interesting. I mean, the Alexander technique owes its origins to a guy named F. Matthias Alexander, and it came out of very practical voice issue that he had to confront. I don't know, from what I've read of Alexander's life, I imagine that if someone told him that his technique could be seen as a kind of Western Zen, I imagine he would have been a bit bemused by that, don't you think?
Yes, definitely. In fact, what he had heard about Eastern methods like yoga, he didn't like.
That's right.
What he had heard was always, he focused what he didn't like about yoga, for example, is what he thought of was the attempt to control directly all the processes in the body, the heartbeat, and that really isn't the point of yoga. So I don't think he may have had that accurate a sense. But I think if he understood what Zen was about, I'm sure he would see that there wasn't any problem. Then I also don't want to say that the two are identical. There's, I don't know, there's similarities, but I want to say what they are is always hard to say.
Mm-hmm. But, so for someone listening to this who is interested in Zen, perhaps practicing Zen, doing Zen sitting, I guess it's called, right?
Right.
What might be a reason for them to consider exploring the Alexander technique?
Well, I'll talk about my experience first, because that's sort of what brought me to it. A big part of Zen practice is sitting meditation, which is you sit in what they would call a good posture, because if your posture in the very broadest sense is good, your mind is alert and relaxed and balanced and attentive. So it's that quiet quality allows more attunement to what one might call reality rather than all our ideas about it. Now, when I studied Zen, a lot of the people who sat ended up injuring themselves. They got knee problems, sciatic problems, and many other kinds of difficulties. And I had a back problem. I didn't have an official injury, but I just found it very uncomfortable to sit. And when I tried to watch my breath, I just got tied up in knots. And in Zen, they put up a lot of importance to the body. They call it the sitting as a yogic practice. It's basically assuming a posture. And it's very important to be able to do that and to be able to learn from it. So I got the impression from sitting for some time that a lot of Westerners are just so out of touch with their bodies and so stiff that they're not really fully benefiting from this practice. And so when I was sitting at a monastery, I met someone who was an Alexander teacher, and she sort of surreptitiously looked at me and said everyone's trying to corner her to have them help with their sitting. And I had never heard about it, and that just put the idea in my head that there might be some benefit. So at any rate, I eventually found an Alexander teacher, and I thought I would take about 5 or 6 lessons and brush up my sitting, and I got more and more involved and got to see that the technique was actually a very effective way to learn to tune into yourself in just the kind of way that they talked about in Zen. And it also gradually made me think that in the West we really don't have an appreciation of this whole realm of sort of subtle energy and attentiveness to ourselves in this way, the very direct way, not a conceptual way, a nonverbal tuning in. And most culture, the East has of course, they have Tai Chi and yoga and Chinese medicine. They all have some notion of a realm of energy, and that where people can notice the subtle qualities of change. Where in the West, we have a more crude way of thinking about ourselves. It's more conceptual. So, again, the technique helps awaken that in a way that I think just sitting practice for many Westerners doesn't. It's very hard for people to get out of their heads and start beginning to really notice what's happening directly.
I'm when you mentioned Tai Chi and yoga, also, of course, Eastern disciplines, and the issues, it makes me think of the issues involved when bringing them to the West. That often they're systems that emerged in a culture where, first of all, there may have been that attention to the subtle directions or energies that you referred to, that there was kind of an assumption that people who practice those disciplines would have that awareness.
Right.
And also, say for yoga in particular, it seems to me there was an assumption that people had a level of flexibility, of physical flexibility,
right. That's
that
right.
simply does not exist in the West in general. I mean, you go to India and people are hanging out in a deep squat, feet
That's
flat
right.
on the
Exactly.
ground, moving
That's
around, shifting
right.
orientation, and it's totally second nature to them. Whereas most of us Westerners, unless we're very small children, may find that a bit of a challenge simply because we're so used to sitting on chairs and slouching on couches.
Yeah, exactly.
And so on. So would you then say that one way of looking at what the Alexander technique could bring to someone who was studying Zen is it's a bit of a makeup for what, as a Westerner, probably they don't have as well
Right.
developed as the natural, say, clientele of Zen Buddhism.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It's a kind of remedial work. Mm-hmm. And I think even for, when I tried to do Tai Chi or yoga before I studied the technique, I would just hurt myself. So I just came to feel that there's a preliminary, and what the technique really has to do with is not any specific movement. It has to do with what you do before you do anything else, how you organize yourself to do something, or even nothing, just sitting. But there's this constant process of reactivity that people are normally not able to monitor, which is, what we could call this realm of energy, or whatever. I mean, energy is just a buzzword, but there's something, some ability to tune into this process that we in Alexander call directing. That's what the technique offers, and without that ability to catch yourself before you started reacting, you just continue to do more of the same.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to turn for a moment to the word posture. I know in Zen Buddhism there is an idea of a sitting posture, right?
Right.
And I assume that term is used,
Yes.
sitting posture. Now, I wonder if the people who developed and practice Zen in the East, if their concept of posture is fundamentally different from what most Westerners have. I think
Right.
in the West, the word posture has become a noun.
Right.
Whereas earlier on, and certainly from a language point of view, posture can mean verb, can be a verb as well.
Right.
Now, today in the West, posture used as a verb has sort of negative connotations.
Right. Right.
But I don't believe that was always the case.
Right.
And
No, they definitely had a different notion. I read one book a long time ago called Hara, Hara, which is the Japanese notion of this area below the navel where sort of the power of your being lies. And they, according to this author, this was before World War II, the Japanese have the ability to sit quietly and sort of contemplatively and just enjoy sitting and being with themselves. And it has to do with kind of lowering the center of their gravity, in a sense, to get it literally means get out of your head. So they have an idea that posture is not just they may not say a verb, but they would say they don't have the idea of a static pose. They have an idea of a kind of dynamic that I like the word tuning into. So they definitely have a completely different notion. They do have certain guidelines, like they will say things like very rough guidelines from our point of view, Alexander teachers, but they would say something like the neck should be back and the spine should be straight and such things. But when they're saying that, that's really within the context of looking for something very alive and not static. And that's assumed with them. It's part of their culture. And so again, when you try to transport a living tradition to another tradition who doesn't have any of the same concepts and presuppositions, it's much more difficult. So when they say sit with a straight spine, they might have a very alive idea, whereas a Western person would just stiffen up and get very uncomfortable and eventually injure themselves. So definitely that's an issue.
And from what you've seen of Zen sitting practices as taught in the West, do you think that the people who are teaching them perhaps don't always realize that the people they're teaching don't have that same concept of posture?
Yeah, I do think that's so. I get the impression, I've noticed in general, some people are more naturals than others. There are some people who do yoga or Tai Chi or sitting that somewhat do pretty well with it. And some of those people probably do well, and they don't understand what's the matter with everyone else who's not doing so well with it, getting all stiff and messed up. So I do think that's the case, that they may not always understand. It can be the classic problem with a teacher saying, do this, and not knowing how to communicate it in detail. And again, that was Alexander's genius. He's somewhere in one of his books, he said that this whole book is dedicated to the pointing out the difficulty of conveying nonverbal concepts verbally, that you cannot tell someone to do X without contending with their whole way of reacting to your instruction. So that's the thing that Zen has not dealt with. And the Eastern way is always do this practice, do it to 10 years, just do it. And there's a certain point where you have to say it's not working. And it may have worked for them, but for a lot of Westerners at least, I don't think it does work that well.
I have to say, I've over the years had a few students who were Zen practitioners, and they've come and brought their cushions with them to sit on so we could explore that. And what I found is that well, pretty much what you said, that immediately they sat down, they stiffened
Right,
themselves and well, set themselves maybe is a better
right,
phrase.
right,
And they would tell me, after 15, 20 minutes of sitting, I'm starting to feel some shoulder pain or neck pain or low back pain,
right,
whatever. And observing them, it's hard to imagine they wouldn't,
right.
given the way they're sitting. And I have found that people who've studied Zen a lot, who do come for lessons, pick up on the Alexander ideas pretty quickly.
Right, because it's a very good context for thinking about them. It gives more practical reality, which is the great thing about it. I mean, I think basically anything that really works and has some truth to it should be compatible um, with each other. And it's
Right.
interesting too. I just want to go off to one little area before we stop. That one of the big issues in Zen is the illusion of our sense of self, that people have this sense that they exist as a kind of isolated kind of entity that surveys the scene, is always apart from their experience. And a lot of Zen is about unmasking that idea. And Alexander, I think, is particularly suited to that. As you advance in the technique and get more subtle, in many ways what you're doing is just developing this kind of unified field of attention that's free of concepts, where you're just observing and noticing. And that is very much what sitting is supposed to cultivate. So you're just fundamentally alert without preconceptions or ideas. And it's very difficult to teach that. And I think Alexander really did find an actual practical and concrete way to gradually bring people to a much deeper level, and to really investigate all these narrowing concepts that keep us stuck. And that's what I really appreciate about what he discovered. I mean, I'm still amazed at what he did with no teachers to help him.
Right. And just for our listeners who may not be familiar with how the Alexander technique is taught, basically Alexander fairly quickly came to realize that he couldn't usually convey what he wanted to a student just by talking to them. He needed to actually use his hands to give them a kind of a gentle guidance to show them what he meant, because people would take his words, run them through the mixer of their preconceptions, and often do something quite different from what he had in mind.
Exactly.
So that's why Alexander, to this day, Alexander teachers will supplement their verbal instructions with hands-on guidance. And I think particularly I would imagine, I'm not a Zen practitioner myself, but I would imagine for someone who is doing Zen sitting, that would be an ideal way to basically learn how to sit more easily.
Yeah,
And for
definitely.
longer periods of time, to support longer periods of meditation.
Yeah.
So maybe this is a good place to end, unless there's something we haven't covered that you
Well,
wanted
I
to
mean,
add.
there's a huge amount to cover, but I guess this gives a sense in sort of a practical way of some ways that the Alexander technique could help Zen practitioners, and vice versa. I mean, I think Zen has a very deep perspective on life that can also inform students of the technique as well. But
Absolutely, yeah.
for me, they've worked very well together. I mean, I'm not practicing Zen right now, but it does inform my way of thinking about the Alexander technique.
Right, right. Well, maybe we'll end on that
Okay, that
note.
sounds good.
And if anything that we have talked about intrigues you, and you live in the New York City area or northern New Jersey, contact Michael, and we'll put a link. We'll put a link to his website by the interview. And if you live anywhere else in the world, we'll also put a link to a site that will enable you to find an Alexander Technique teacher anywhere in the world. Michael, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Okay, thanks, Robert.